right, I think we're reassembling. Come on in. And we're going to head into the final panel of the day, which is last but not least, this is going to be a combination of both the history of the wireless technology research that had been going on since the 1990s, the whole dawn of the mobile phone industry, which was the world's largest research project in wireless safety. And that is combined with our wireless competing on safety panel, which is a new and really growing area in the industry, but not a new and growing area in the minds of a lot of really accomplished academics and authors and scientists who've been studying this for decades. And it's important to get this into the mindset, I think, of the industry as part of competing on safety, which is, I think, is a new growth sector. And as a start, to kick this off, we'll start with Dr. George Carlo. And to give you a little background on Dr. Carlo, he's a world-recognized medical scientist, a best-selling author, and attorney. His career spans 35 years and more than 250 medical, scientific, and public policy publications in the areas of human performance, public safety, healthcare, consumer protection, and metabolic mechanisms. He's advanced degrees in medical science, neuropsychology, physiology, natural sciences, and biology, and he's written 3 books, and his discoveries have been incorporated into the United States and global patents in areas including neurophysiological function, antiviral pharmaceuticals, medical devices, environmental protection technologies, mind-body balance, leadership, and human performance. Dr. Carlo has held appointments as chairman of the nonprofit Science and Public Policy Institute and Secrets of Champions Ltd., both based in Washington, D.C. He's presently chairman of the Secrets of Champions Foundation based in Jamestown, New York, a visiting professor at Longwood University in Virginia, and past chairman of the Board of Trustees for McKay Preparatory Academy for Autistic Children in Sarasota, Florida. Welcome, Dr. Carlo.
Thank you, Joe, for those kind words. Appreciate it. You know, the last time I spoke to an industry group was about 25 years ago, and we were giving the final report to the board of CTIA on the program that I'm going to talk about here. And when I got to the meeting in New Orleans, there were 2 muscle men meeting me at the curb. They took me in to a holding room until it was my turn to talk. And when I finished my speech, they escorted me to the curb and called me a cab. So I appreciate being able to roam, Joe. Thank you for that. Okay. Now the thing that I want to talk about today, and I'm going to be brief so that we can have a nice discussion with the panel, is this wireless technology research program that I was the head of in the 90s. And it's important to distinguish between science, basic science, and regulatory science, which is a part of applied science. So it's one of those things where the part of the misinterpretation of what the WTR was about was because it was being categorized as basic science when it was applied regulatory science. It's one of the things I want to go through. And then just one other point of context so you know where I come from on this. You know, way back in the late 70s when I was working on my doctorate, I was at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York. And during the first week of a cancer epidemiology course, the professor was talking about how if you smoke too much, you could get lung cancer. And the second week talked about how if you drink too much, you could get liver cancer. And the third week talked about how if you have too much sex and you're a man, you could get prostate cancer, and if you're a woman, you could get cervical cancer. And so in the fourth week, a student raised his hand and says, "Professor, if I don't smoke, and I don't drink, and I don't have sex, can you promise me that I'll live 100 years? He He thought about it and he said, no, but it'll seem like 100 years. Now, the point is that everything has risk, and that's what we're talking about. And risk science is aimed at identifying those things that are risky and figuring out how to manage those risks so the benefits can be realized going forward. So that's the context of what I'd like to talk about here. Now, worked. Okay, the why of this. The first thing is we need to get a return on a $75 million investment that was made by the telecommunications industry and the federal government back in the 90s through to today. Now, where's the 75 million number come from? We're in Washington. We can fiddle with numbers. First thing is that the WTR was a $28.5 million program in the 90s. In today's money, it's 54 million. So 54 million is worked in there. There were also programs that were part of the WTR that were not completed by the WTR for various political reasons, but were completed by the government. That was another 25 million. So that's where the $75 million investment comes from, and part of what we need to do is get a return on that. Now, one thing that we have done is that all of the documentation from the WTR, and I'm going to go through this with you a little bit, all of that information now, the hard copies, something like 17,000 documents, have been donated to the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy recently. And through the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy, we want to make that information available to anybody in the public who can use that information to further risk management around telecommunications. And Betsy Lehrfeld is here, who's the president of the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy, and she will be the person to contact in order to get information there. Okay, now, second point, sustainability of the privacy, security, and safety domains of the present telecom landscape is not what you might think. What's bubbling below the surface is troublesome, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but that's another why we need to do this now, why it's time now. And it's time for constructive and collaborative action with urgency and purpose from all perspectives. It's not one side of the coin here. It's time for us to work together. Now, we need to consider the full picture of how we got here. The history is important. We need a reality check on where we are. Just the facts, not the opinions, just the facts. And then we need to have a path forward that is resilient and sustainable. And earlier today, everybody's talking about that, whether it's with satellites or whatever. We're all in the same boat, and it's time. Now, where we came from. Communications technology successes began with the 1858 laying of the first transatlantic cable. I'm old, I wasn't there at the time, but that's where it all started, 1858. And then we got to a point where we had landline phones across the entire country. It had an impact on all walks of life. It was amazing. And then cell phones. And cell phones ushered in a wireless revolution. Everything was going fine. And then there was this lawsuit called Raynard versus NEC Corporation in 1992. This is a brain cancer claim. And the guy who was the plaintiff, his name was David Raynard. He he owned a store that sold cell phones and those types of things. He was in the industry. He was an industry guy. His wife was pregnant. She had a difficult pregnancy, and she had a hard time getting up out of bed. So he gave her a cell phone and said to help her with her pregnancy. So she had the cell phone next to her. She developed a brain tumor. Her doctor was a young guy back then. His name was Dr. David Perlmutter. And Perlmutter said, it's interesting because the tumor is near where the phone was laying on the bed. And David Raynard brought this lawsuit, and they were invited to go on Larry King Live. And what Dr. Perlmutter did was he brought this X-ray on Larry King Live, and then he showed where the phone was. And it was a powerful image that no one had ever seen before. It was new. Now, the industry mounted a response to that. And the reason was because within the subsequent days after Larry King Live, there were impacts that were seen in the stock market on the shares of these companies. So the industry held a press conference. The guy who was the speaker his name was Ed Stiano. At the time, he was the head of Motorola. And he said, there's nothing to worry about here because there are thousands of studies that prove that cell phones are safe. And of course, the media was like, oh, God, thanks, man. Okay, where are the studies? Well, the studies were studies of microwave ovens. And at the time, the thinking was that the only adverse effect could be from heating. And when it was clear that there were no studies, there were not thousands of studies, Washington kicked in. Now, you know how it is when Congress gets involved in things. It was the same back then. So what they decided was we need to have a hearing, and we need to learn something about this. We need to know what's going on. So Congressman Ed Markey, he's a senator now from Massachusetts, but he was a congressman back then. He was the chair of the committee, brought in a group and said, okay, what's going on here? What is going on? How can we have this going on with no obvious remedy? And it turns out that in those hearings, it became clear that cell phones and the infrastructure were both exempted from any pre-market testing. There was no pre-market testing. This is in the early 80s. And the basis for exempting them from the pre-market testing was something that was later termed low power exclusion. And the idea there was based on how wireless communication with cell phones was envisioned at the time, in 1982, based on how it was envisioned, the signal was going to go from a cell phone a short distance to tie into the landline phones. That was the concept. And it was not a flawed concept. That's what the vision was. And based on that, the conclusion was that because the signals don't have to go long distance, it's going to be low power, and it's not going to be enough to heat tissue. Now, the other concept that was later found to be flawed was that heating was the only mechanism for harm. That's not true. But back then, that's what they thought. But anyway, point was low power exclusion, no pre-market testing. Okay. Who was responsible for that? Well, the FDA, the EPA. So you had these regulatory agencies that were being shown to be asleep at the switch. At the time that the hearing was done in 1992, this first hearing, the only remedy in law was recall of cell phones. It was the only remedy available. So as this hearing process went forward, the industry looked at this and said, we got to do something here. If you have no pre-market testing, there's no post-market surveillance, we don't know if there are dangers, this is a problem. So the head of CTIA at the time was a young guy named Tom Wheeler. And Tom had just come over from the Cable and Wireless Trade Association, and he had seen the way the TIA had sort of messed up the first response to this. So he saw an opportunity for CTIA, which is the trade association for the carriers, and stepped up and told Congress, we'll handle this, we'll fill in the data, we'll spend $15 to $25 million over the next 3 to 5 years, fill in the data so that decisions can be made about health risks based on real data. That's what he proposed, and Congress said, you know what, that's a good idea. Congress then said to the rest of the said to the executive branch, go fix this. What happened was, all of these federal agencies, CDC, EPA, NIOSH, OSHA, FDA, FCC was in the mix, OSHA, NIH, all of them were put into the position of having an official interagency working group of the federal government to oversee whatever work was going to be done to fill in the data. Now, during those times, I had done some other work in this area. I was able to sit down with Tom Wheeler. I was asked by the FDA, Dave Kessler was head of the FDA at the time, and he said, just go over there and tell those guys what they need to do, because they've never done any regulatory science stuff before. There are rules that we have from the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and all that. Just go tell them what they have to do. So went and had the meeting and gave them a report and said, this is what is required, and the interagency working group will oversee it. And that's how the whole process began. Now, the thing that was important is that we didn't know a hell of a lot back then about dosimetry, about exposure, about toxicology with regard to radiofrequency radiation, about epidemiology. We didn't know. We didn't know a lot. So what was important was to assess what we knew and then make a plan for what we needed to do going forward. So we ended up doing that, made a report to the industry, and then what happened is the White House got involved. And they said, this is a pretty good program, because we had peer review at all levels. We had the Harvard School of Public Health ready to peer review the proposals, the RFPs, the analyses proposed, all of that stuff, all the way through to the final report. The peer review was in there. We also had an open policy so that the media could get access to anything that we were doing. We wanted it in the light of day, and that was part of the program. And when the General Accounting Office saw that, and at the time, the head of OMB was Leon Panetta, and this was during the Clinton administration, and he saw this and he said, holy smokes, this is the kind of thing we got to do. So I got a letter from the White House, because at the time, what we had was something called a science advisory group to the wireless industry. So I got this letter and it said, this thing would be perfect if it were set up as an independent entity. And so based on that, we followed the recommendation, and we set up an entity called Wireless Technology Research, WTR. It's a limited liability company, a nonprofit LLC, and it was set up as an independent entity. And the idea was to go forward and put together fine-tuned components of this research agenda, put out RFPs, and get this work done. Now, the restructuring of this from the Science Advisory Group to the Wireless Technology Research made sense to everybody except for my good friend Tom Wheeler. And the problem there was that the independence of the WTR was a problem in terms of the industry being able to control how information was disseminated, what was done, and all of that stuff. So we went forward with the program, but the close alliance that had originally been there between the Industry Trade Association and the WTR began to unravel. And during the time we were doing this, CTIA showed very, very strong support for the WTR in the public. Very strong support. And they were talking about their commitment to health and safety, safety of consumers, and all that stuff. And they were using the WTR as sort of the shield for that, as the proof, which was part of the plan, as far as they were concerned. Our job was to do the work, figure out what had to be done. Now, this wasn't just some happenstance project. We had 137 university, regulatory, and public policy partners from around the world. The WTR was sort of a big deal. I call out this COST 244 program of the EU. That's the Cooperative Organization for Science and Technology. And the members of COST 244 were countries. They had a vote, and they allowed the WTR to become a member, the only non-country member of COST 244. That is how high the esteem was for what the WTR was about. Industry contributors, 151 separate corporate entities representing the full range of telecommunications interests put money into the WTR. So everybody was on the same page for a while, until we had a process in the WTR where we had universities looking for new information that was indicating potential risk in certain areas with regard to wireless. And our surveillance guys at the University of Buffalo, they identified that digital phones might be interfering with implanted cardiac pacemakers. Because at the time, 1994, 95, 96, most cell phones were analog. We hadn't moved into the digital world yet. And that was a different type of signaling. So according to our protocols, we got a group at the Mayo Clinic, another group at the University of Oklahoma, and a third clinical group from Boston University to conduct the same study on interference in 3 places. We wanted to have instant corroboration, because in the risk science area, you can't wait around to get the exact data replicated by somebody else 10 years down the line or whatever. If there are dangers, you have to take steps right away. So we found that digital phones interfered with implanted cardiac pacemakers in all 3 studies, in all 3 university settings, hospital settings. Not a good thing, because some of the interference was inhibition. Inhibition is serious. If you're pacemaker dependent and you have interference that causes inhibition, you have no heartbeat. That's not good. So that because of the inhibition, we said, okay, we got to go fast with this. Called the New England Journal of Medicine. At the time, they were a big one. We said, okay, we got to get this out there. Okay, they published it. A week later, get a call from Wheeler. No more money. We're done. Now, we were doing what we were supposed to do. We identified a risk. We had to have this risk management. And so, they said, well, we're going to do it anymore. So I went over and I said, look, Tom, if it's me, let me step down, bring somebody else in, but this work needs to go forward. It wasn't just about the pacemakers, because by that time, we had working groups looking at dosimetry, epidemiology, toxicology, designing exposure systems that made sense to be able to extrapolate from animals to humans. Sort of a little side story. Let me give you a quick story here. We had 3 main people who were on the science, who were the head of the WTR, myself, Dr. Bill Guy, who back in those days was, he knew everything, and another guy, Dr. Ian Monroe from Canada. Both of those guys, unfortunately, have passed away. But we were in a conference room, and we were this problem of exposure in animal studies and rat studies was a difficult one, because if you had the probe or the generator of the signal looking straight at the rat, the hot spot was halfway down the back of the rat. And the big question had to do with brain cancer. So the challenge was, how can we use an animal study, a rat study, to be able to extrapolate to humans. And it was hard. It was a big challenge. And so I went up to the board and I drew a rat, and I'm not a good artist. It was awful. And people started laughing in the room. And then Bill Guy said, wait a minute, that's brilliant. First time he had ever said anything I had done was brilliant. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, it looks like an airplane. I said, airplane? He goes, yeah. He said, I know the guy at Northwestern University who invented stealth technology. He can help us design this exposure system, because stealth technology is all about reflection and refraction of those types of signals. So anyway, got a hold. His name was Dr. Alan Taflov. He helped us, and he helped us put that exposure system together. Sort of cool. Anyway, as all of that was going on, I said to Tom, I'll step down, no problem. But you got to keep this work going. In the toxicology area, in the dosimetry area, in the epidemiology area, this stuff's got to go. And I went over to the head of the interagency working group at the time. Her name was Dr. Elizabeth Jacobson. And I went to her and I said, look, I've gone to, and by the way, the interagency working group met every quarter with us. That whole group of government people, they were involved in every step, designing what the research needed to be. They did their own peer review. They understood how it was supposed to be applied in the regulatory system, all of that. So they were right in the middle of it. I went there, said, look, this is, I've tendered my resignation if they want to. She said, no, we're not going to do that. You got to run this. So she calls Tom and said, we're going to have to go forward. So what happens is they negotiate back and forth to re-engage the WTR project. Two things were negotiated out. One of them was the long-term animal study. The long-term animal study that later became the NTP study. That was conceived of and designed, for the most part, in the WTR, and was later, it was negotiated out. So CTIA said, look, get rid of that study, and at the end of the work that you're doing, we're going to get a second look by the government. And, fine with me, because we're simply following the science. So anyway, that's how it went forward. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out is that in the intervention working groups, which leads into our competing on safety, in the intervention working groups, we had industry people in charge of those working groups. Guys from Motorola, guys from AT&T, because it's the industry who knows how to do this. So you've got to have the industry involved. So we had them involved in those working groups. Now, and I'm going to get this done pretty quickly. I'm sorry I'm talking so long. But there was a bumpy road, okay? There was litigation surrounding the WTR work from the beginning. Now, this particular thing on the right, if you look at the bottom, I don't know if there's a pointer on this, but the last guy who's a defendant is me, personally. Now, you haven't lived until you're on a layover in Hawaii coming back from Australia. You hear something on CNN that says there's a new cell phone lawsuit. And of course, I'm wanting to see what it was. Sitting in a chair at the bar, well, it's the way it was. And my name is flashed on the screen. $80 million lawsuit. Didn't have $80 million, scared the hell out of me. But that was just one example of how litigation encircled all of this as we went forward. Now, litigation was going on, and you had the new sort of explosion of wireless technology under a different type of infrastructure. Remember at the beginning, we're going to tie into landlines? Well, that couldn't sustain digital signaling, TDMA, CDMA, all of those different modulation forms, all of that stuff, those protocols. So had to have an infrastructure that was unique and set aside. The birth of cell towers and antennas on cell towers, all of that. Now, this was in the 94, 95, 96 timeframe. And one of the things that our friend over in the White House thought of, Leon Panetta, was instead of just issuing these licenses, why don't we have an auction? And we can auction off these licenses and put money in the U.S. Treasury. So the idea was, okay, let's do that. Let's have an auction. Well, when they put the concept of the auction together, and this was before the TCA, the Telecommunications Act of 96 was passed, I remember having a meeting with Tom Wheeler, and Tom said, look, where do you guys stand on this SAR, this specific absorption rate, as a standard for safety? I said, we stand nowhere, because it's not a standard for safety. It can't be, because it measures heating. There isn't obvious mechanisms. We later, published some papers on this, and Tom was mad as hell. And he said, look, he goes, these people who are going to be bidding on this stuff, they need to know if they're bidding on the Mona Lisa or some hen scratch. I said, not my problem. The science does not allow us to do that. And my friends over at the EPA feel the same way. And our friends over at FDA feel the same way. And the people at NIOSH and OSHA feel the same way as well. So what happens in the Telecommunications Act of 96, the game changes, and they say all of these people, FDA, EPA, OSHA, NIOSH, CDC, all of them, they're going to be relegated to advisory roles under the new Telecommunications Act. And all of the authority and responsibility for testing and safety is going to be with the FCC. Okay, now, we had a lot of friends at the FCC, and I still do. But the FCC is a political commission. It's not a cabinet-level regulatory agency. They did not have protocols to rely on with regard to risk assessment, risk management. They were not in this business. And if you talked to the guys at the FCC at the time, they're like, oh my God, what are we going to do here? The authority and responsibility went there. The other thing that happened, and most people don't know about this, is that you remember in the 90s, everything was a little bit crazy with .com and .bomb, all that stuff. And you had all of these cowboys out there with all this money making on the internet and all that stuff. Well, a lot of these guys were the ones who were bidding on spectrum at the time. Now, what happened was the spectrum auctions got out of hand, billions of dollars, more than anybody could have imagined. But the guys who won in the bidding didn't have the money to pay until they finished the build out. So the FCC said, okay, we'll carry the paper. Imagine that. So now you have the FCC, who's supposed to be the regulatory authority, holding the mortgage and is incentivized for quicker build out of the infrastructure so that those guys can pay for the auction. There was a good Newsweek article about that in 1997. Okay. This caused splits in the coalition. And when I mean the coalition, the people who are on the health and safety side, sustainability side, the industry, and it got to be a real mess. So I'm almost done. What we ended up doing in the WTR, because at the time we had work to do in by the way, when they reconstituted the money, it was the end of 1996. So we only had a couple more years. There were some studies, the long-term animal study was going to be done by the FDA, and so that there were a lot of, by NTP. There were a lot of things that we couldn't do. So what we decided to do was document everything and summarize it, and we did that first in the research agenda, which you would be able to get a copy of through NESLAP. We also published 2 compendium books called State of the Science that were based on colloquia, one of them that we held in Rome in 1995, and the other one was at the end of the WTR program in Long Beach, California. And those are sort of summaries of the peer-reviewed data that are part of the WTR. Now, here's the other thing. If I look back and say, did we make a mistake not requiring that these studies that we did, 56 different studies and reports, were not published in the open scientific literature? Did we make a mistake by not requiring that as part of the contracts? And I would say yes, that was a mistake. Our thinking at the time was that if somebody's doing a study, they're going to have 1,000 pages of data and analyses and all that kind of stuff. And if you're going to go publish it in a journal, you got to consolidate that down to 10 pages. And the idea was for us, from a scientific regulatory science point of view, we wanted to make our decisions based on all the data. Now, we were wrong. We should have had this stuff published. We should have made that a requirement, but that's in the information that NSLAP has now. Now, just one other side thing. One of the things that we found and we did put out into the public was the formation, genetic damage in human blood exposed to RF. Now, it was a finding that was corroborating some early genetic damage studies from the mid-90s. And when we finished that, the CTIA followed through on what one of their negotiations was, is that we're going to have the government take another look at this. So they engaged in a cooperative research and development agreement with the CTIA. So CTIA stepped in and said, we're going to start doing the research now because WTR, you're done. You got your money, you're done, you're gone. So this cooperative research and development agreement was the genetic damage in human blood replication. They did the study, they replicated the WTR findings, and it was published, but most of you never heard of it. Okay, because by that time, a lot of the clash of science, business, politics, and public policy was out there. So the last thing that I thought I needed to do to put a bow on this was to talk about the clash of science, business, politics, and public policy, and did that in the Invisible Hazards book. Now, where are we? Okay, we know the regulatory science now. Okay, that was 30 years ago we started that. We know a lot now. We can fix this now. We know the risks on multiple levels, and this tobacco road thing, something I would give you a little bit of homework if you wanted to do some. The closest thing between cell phones and as a consumer product and what we've had historically with another consumer product is tobacco. And the tobacco road, if you will, that led to the agreement that was reached in 1999 was a $206 billion settlement with the tobacco industry. And in that settlement, you have things like, no more advertising, you can't, target kids, all of those things. Plus, they set up a group called the Truth Project, who is funded under the settlement to make sure that the industry doesn't do things to cover up, okay? Now, we have the same kind of thing going on now with cell phones. I'm sorry, that is my ringer, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm sorry about that. Okay. So what's going on is, we've had lawsuits since Reynard. Okay. We have had now, government, involvement. Of late, we have these attorneys general from several states involved in litigation against the social media companies and others. That the attorneys general involvement in the tobacco litigation is what led to the settlement. That's what led to it. So that the tobacco experience is something that's the same road that we're on now. So basically, we know the path. We know how to do this. So we need to move it forward. It's time. This panel, competing on safety, we have the knowledge. Now the thing is, it has to be incentivized the right way. It's got to be incentivized because the people who are not in the industry don't know enough about how to fix the problem from a technological point of view. We've got to have industry in this, and competing on safety is one avenue. And we also need to understand that the privacy, security, safety, and sustainability, those things are all triggered by the same kind of thing. So they have to be collaborated. Let's seize the day. That's it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carlo. So that's quite a history lesson, and for those of you who are interested in further, definitely look up Dr. Carlo's books.